Have you ever genuinely felt deep in your bones that you weren't alone, even when every logical part of your brain screamed otherwise? That insidious whisper of a presence just beyond the veil of sight, a cold breath on your neck in a sweltering room? If not, count yourself lucky, because what I'm about to tell you isn't some campfire tale spun for cheap thrills. This is a memory, a scar really, from a summer night in the forgotten wilds of America, a night that redefined terror for me. And while I might never fully grasp the truth of what happened, I assure you the fear was as real as the sweat that ran down my spine. The ending? It won't give you closure, only a chilling, lingering question. It was mid-July 3 years ago, when the city heat became unbearable. I'm Brandon, 31 at the time, and a distant great-aunt I'd never met had bequeathed me a small, dilapidated cabin in rural Kentucky. It was deep in the woods, bordering the Daniel Boone National Forest, the kind of place you went to disappear, not to find peace. My initial plan was to clear it out, list it, and be done with it. But the sheer isolation, the thick canopy of trees muffling the world, had an unexpected allure. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just me and the oppressive summer hum of insects. It felt like stepping into a forgotten corner of time. The first day was uneventful, almost therapeutic. I cleaned, swept out decades of dust, and patched a leaky window. The cabin itself was simple: 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a rickety porch. It smelled of old wood, damp earth, and something vaguely metallic like old pennies. As dusk bled into night, the cicadas launched their deafening chorus. I cooked a meager dinner over a portable gas stove, the shadows lengthening around me. The silence, broken only by the forest, was profound. It felt heavy, pregnant with untold stories. I remember thinking, as I lay on an old cot, that I finally understood what getting away from it all truly meant. I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the distant hoot of an owl and the creaks of the old house settling. Just the normal sounds of a house in the wilderness. Or so I told myself. The second night was different. The heat was still a suffocating blanket, but there was a peculiar stillness in the air. The cicadas, usually so boisterous, were muted, their chorus a distant hum rather than a roaring wall of sound. I was reading by the flickering beam of a battery-powered lantern when I first heard it, a sound faint at first, like a faraway melody carried on a whisper of wind. It wasn't music, not really. It was more a sustained, wavering vocalization, a hum, perhaps, or a low, mournful sigh. It had an unsettling quality, slightly off-key, like something ancient trying to remember a forgotten tune. I paused, lantern held aloft, straining my ears. Nothing, just the soft rustle of leaves outside, probably some local's radio. I mumbled to myself, trying to dismiss it, but this was deep in the woods, miles from any paved road, let alone a power line strong, enough to carry a signal this far. I shrugged, attributed it to an overactive imagination fueled by isolation, and went back to my book. Minutes later, it returned, closer this time, Definitely a voice. It wasn't singing words, not in any language I knew. It was a mournful, drawn-out sound, rising and falling in an unnatural cadence. It made the hair on my arms stand on end. Goosebumps prickled my skin despite the stifling heat. This wasn't an animal, and it certainly wasn't human. Not like any human I'd ever heard. It sounded stretched, distorted, as if played through an old, warped vinyl. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I extinguished the lantern, plunging the cabin into near total darkness, save for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the grimy window panes. My eyes adjusted, and the shadows outside the window seemed to coalesce into deeper, more menacing shapes. The trees, usually comforting sentinels, now looked like skeletal fingers reaching. The sound intensified. It was distinctly coming from the direction of the back wall of the cabin, the one facing the thickest part of the forest. It was a repetitive, almost meditative chant now, growing louder, closer. It sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. And then I heard something else, a faint scraping sound, like something dragging lightly across the rough wooden siding. Scritch, scritch, I froze, barely breathing. My eyes darted around the small room. The old cot, piled with my supplies, seemed a flimsy barrier against whatever was outside. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation. A branch rubbing against the wall? A curious animal? No, the scraping was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It accompanied the strange, keening sound. Then there was a soft tap at the window I had just patched that morning. It wasn't forceful, not like someone trying to break in. It was gentle, almost inquisitive. And another tap, and another, following the cadence of the strange vocalization. Tap, 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 tap. Paralysis seized me. Every muscle screamed at me to move, to hide, to do anything, but I was rooted to the spot. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the window, a single pane of glass now seeming impossibly thin. The moonlight was weak, but I imagined I could see a faint, elongated shadow moving just beyond the glass. It wasn't quite human-shaped. Too thin, too tall, with a head that seemed to tilt at an unnatural angle. My rational brain fought back, screaming, "It's just the shadows, your imagination." But something primal, deep within me, knew better. The scraping stopped. The tapping stopped. The vocalization stopped. The silence that followed was 1,000 times worse than the noise. It was a suffocating, absolute silence, devoid of even the cricket's hum. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, a new sound. It came from the front porch, right at the door. A soft, almost tentative click. The doorknob. It was turning, slowly, gently. My blood ran cold, solidifying in my veins. The door was made of thick, aged wood, secured with a simple deadbolt. I had locked it. I knew I had. But the click came again, and then a faint creak. The door wasn't opening, but it sounded as if something was pressing against it, testing its given. And then, a whisper, right at the keyhole. It wasn't the strange, ancient song. This was closer to human speech, yet utterly alien. Garbled, indistinct, like trying to understand someone speaking underwater. But one phrase seemed to coalesce from the murky depths of the sound, repeated over and over, chilling me to my core. Let me in. It was faint, barely audible, but undeniable. And it was coming from right outside the door, impossibly close, from what felt like a mouth pressed against the wood. My mind shrieked. My body tingled with a frantic, desperate need. To flee. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice was stuck and my legs felt like lead. I clamped my hands over my mouth, terrified of making a sound, of letting them know I was truly awake, truly listening. The whispering continued, growing infinitesimally louder, more distorted. It wasn't a plea. It was an instruction. A demand. I could almost feel a cold breath seeping through the gaps in the door. I squeezed my eyes shut, burying my face into the rough fabric of the cot's mattress, praying for dawn, for oblivion, for anything to make it stop. The cabin felt impossibly small. A flimsy box against an unimaginable presence. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sounds persisted, an agonizing symphony of faint whispers, creaks, and that indescribable scraping from the back wall, as if whatever it was had moved from the window to the very foundations of the cabin. Then, as abruptly as it began, it all stopped. No sound, no movement, just the heavy silence of the deep woods. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't move. I lay there, rigid, until the first sliver of gray light pierced the darkness through the window, painting faint outlines on the wall. Only then, with the promise of sunrise, did I dare to stir. The moment it was bright enough to see, I was up. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my backpack. I didn't care about anything else. I didn't check the windows, didn't inspect the door. The metallic smell in the air seemed stronger, clinging to the wooden beams. I grabbed my keys, threw my phone, still dead, and wallet inside, and burst out of the cabin, not bothering to lock the door behind me. I didn't look back. I just ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, started the engine, and peeled out of that driveway, leaving a cloud of dust in my wake. I drove for hours, not stopping until I hit a major highway, and the sun was high in the sky. I never went back to that cabin. I never even listed it for sale. It still sits there, untouched, deep in those woods. Sometimes, on a quiet summer night, even in the bustling city, a faint, off-key hum will seem to drift on the breeze, or a distant sound will distort and stretch in a way that makes my blood run cold. Was it a hallucination brought on by isolation and fear? A trick of the mind fed by the oppressive quiet? Or was it something else, something ancient and malevolent that simply desired to be let in? I don't know, but I do know this. I'll never experience a summer night in the quiet dark the same way again. The truth remains elusive, but the terror was undeniably real. And sometimes I still wonder who Or what is still waiting in that forgotten corner of Kentucky? What if the things that truly terrify us aren't the monsters under the bed, but the ones that walk among us unseen on a sweltering summer night when the world feels too still? A shadow that moves against the moon, a whisper that cuts through, the drone of cicadas, a cold touch that leaves no mark but chills you to the bone. This isn't some campfire tale. This is a true story, something that happened to me one summer night, and to this day, it's a memory that claws at the edges of my sanity. The ending? Well, it never really ended. It was the summer of 2019. A few weeks after graduating college, my buddy, Mark, had invited me and our friend, Sarah, to his family's old hunting cabin up in Oak Haven, Pennsylvania. Not a town so much as a cluster of houses clinging to the edge of the Allegheny National Forest. No cell service, just miles of ancient, whispering trees and a pervasive humidity that made the air feel thick enough to chew. We were there to celebrate, to decompress, to escape the real world for a bit before the inevitable plunge into adulting. Cabin itself was rustic, perched on a slight rise overlooking a creek, surrounded by a wall of pines and oaks. Inside, it smelled of dust and old wood smoke. We spent the first few days hiking, fishing in the creek, and drinking cheap beer around a crackling fire, telling ghost stories that felt more jovial than genuinely scary. The nights were the worst, not because of heat, but because of the silence. It was a dense, heavy silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. But sometimes, just sometimes, there was something else. A sound that was off-dot, it started subtly. A rustle in the undergrowth that wasn't quite a deer. A snap of a twig when there was no breeze. We'd shrug it off, blame it on our overactive imaginations, fueled by late-night horror movies. But then, on the fourth night, things shifted. Air was unusually heavy, even for July. The sky was an inky black, the stars obscured by a low-hanging haze. The cicadas were deafening, a pulsating hum that vibrated through the very ground. We'd had a few too many beers, and Mark, in a fit of adventurous stupidity, suggested we go for a walk. Just down to the creek, see if we can spot any nocturnal critters, he slurred. Sarah, always up for anything, agreed. I, being the perpetually cautious one, felt a prickle of unease. The woods at night, especially these woods, felt different, oppressive, but I went along. We stumbled through the narrow, barely there path, our cheap flashlights cutting weak cones through the darkness. The air grew cooler as we descended towards the creek, the sound of rushing water growing louder. That's when it hit us. Not the creek, but the silence around the creek. The cicadas, which had been a constant drone, had abruptly stopped. All of them. It was like someone had flicked a switch on the entire forest. The only sound was our heavy breathing and the distant gurgle of the water. Did you hear that? Sarah whispered, her voice tight. Hear what? Mark mumbled, swaying slightly. The silence, I said, a shiver running down my spine despite the heat. The cicadas just stopped. A low, guttural sound answered me from the dense foliage to our left. It wasn't an animal call. It was a dry, raspy click, like two pieces of bone grinding together, followed by a sound that was almost a sigh, but too deep, too slow to be human. Mark tried to laugh it off. A nervous, shaky sound, probably a deer or a bear. Bears don't make that sound, Sarah retorted, clutching my arm. Her nails dug in, cold and sharp. We froze, our flashlights sweeping wildly. Nothing, just an impenetrable wall of leaves and shadows. But the feeling was there, the unmistakable sensation of being watched, of being hunted. It wasn't just my imagination. I could feel the hairs on my arms standing up, an electric current of primal fear. "Let's go back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Now, we turned, the path suddenly seeming longer, darker. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch sounded like a footstep. We started walking faster, then power walking. The alcohol-induced bravado completely evaporated. The clicks started again, closer this time, moving parallel to us through the dense undergrowth, always just out of sight. Click, click, it was mocking, calculating. Suddenly, Sarah cried out, stumbling. Her flashlight beam shot wildly into the trees. "Did you see that?" she gasped, scrambling back to her feet. "A shadow, like too tall. It just darted behind that oak." I didn't see it, but I felt it. A momentary drop in temperature, a brief sensation of profound dread washing over me. We didn't need to discuss it. We broke into a full-blown run, crashing through the underbrush, tripping over roots, our breaths ragged. The clicks followed, gaining on us, faster now, sometimes from ahead, sometimes directly behind. It sounded like something was shuffling, dragging itself through the forest, impossibly fast for the terrain. Then terror struck. As we rounded a bend in the path, Mark, who was leading, let out a choked cry. His flashlight beam pointed straight up, then tumbled to the ground, spinning, erratically, casting grotesque shadows. He was gone, just gone. The path ahead was empty. "Mark!" Sarah screamed, her voice tearing through the night. We skidded to a halt. The clicks had stopped. The air hung thick and heavy, charged with an unspoken threat. The gurgle of the creek, now far behind us, was the only natural sound. "Mark?" I yelled, my voice cracking. I swept my flashlight into the darkness where he'd vanished. Nothing, just trees. Then, from directly behind us, a low, guttural chuckle. It sounded like gravel scraping against a dry throat, chilling and utterly inhuman. It was so close, I felt a puff of cold air on the back of my neck. Sarah let out a shriek that ripped through me. Without thinking, I grabbed her arm and we bolted. We didn't look back. We didn't stop running. Up the steep path, our lungs burning, our legs screaming, until the cabin lights finally flickered into view through the trees. We burst through the door, slamming it shut and throwing the deadbolt, gasping for air, trembling uncontrollably. We stood there, leaning against the door, hyperventilating, listening. The sounds of the forest outside were back. The cicadas, the distant hoot of an owl. Everything seemed normal, except for the gnawing terror in our chests. "Mark," Sarah whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "Where's Mark?" Just then, the front door rattled. A terrified groan came from the other side. "Let me in. For God's sake, let me in." It was Mark. His voice was hoarse, ragged, laced with pure panic. We yanked open the door. Mark collapsed inside, panting, utterly white. His eyes were wide with a terror that mirrored ours. He had a long, deep scratch running down his arm, bleeding sluggishly. It grabbed me," he gasped, pushing himself away from the door as if something might follow him through. Something big, cold. It just pulled me into the trees. I fought it. I don't know how I got away. It was tall. So tall. And those sounds. He trailed off, trembling, staring at some unseen horror only he could perceive. We spent the rest of that night huddled together, refusing to turn off the lights, clutching whatever we could find as a weapon. Every creak of the old cabin, every whisper of wind outside, sent fresh waves of terror through us. We saw nothing else, heard nothing else beyond the normal sounds of the forest, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, never left. Next morning, we were zombies. We packed up our things in a terrified frenzy, barely speaking. We didn't bother with breakfast. We just drove. We drove out of Oakhaven, out of the Alleghenies, and we didn't look back. That was years ago. And we never really talked about it again. Not in detail. We tried once, months later, but the words just wouldn't form. The memory was too raw, too deeply unsettling. Mark still has that scar on his arm, and sometimes, when he thinks no one is looking, I see him touch it, his eyes distant, haunted. Sarah won't go camping anymore, not even in state parks. And me? I hear the cicadas every summer, and sometimes, late at night, when the world is still and the air is heavy with humidity, I hear that sound. Clack, a dry, clicking whisper just at the edge of hearing, always just out of sight. I try to convince myself it's my imagination, a lingering trauma, but deep down, I know better. It never really ended. I just came back. And sometimes, I wonder if it's still out there, in the oppressive silence of a summer night, waiting. Or worse, if it found a way to follow me home. What if I told you the most beautiful, serene summer night could morph into your deepest, most primal fear? Because I lived it. And even now, years later, the truth of what transpired during those sweltering July nights in the Adirondacks makes my blood run cold. I'm Alex, 30 years old at the time, a software engineer, burnt out by the relentless hum of New York City. It was July 2019, a peak summer, and I needed an escape, somewhere quiet, remote, completely unplugged. I found it, or so I thought, in a rustic cabin north of Lake Placid, tucked deep within the Adirondack wilderness. It was one of those off-grid rentals, solar-powered, with no Wi-Fi, just a spotty cell signal if you stood on the porch and aimed your phone just right. Perfect. The first couple of days were blissful. The air hung thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The only sound the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. I read, hiked, cooked simple meals over a campfire, and truly started to unwind. The nights were particularly enchanting. The sky a vast canvas of stars, unmarred by light pollution. I relished the silence. It was on the third night that the silence began to feel less like peace and more like a vacuum. I was downstairs, reading by the dim glow of a battery lamp, when I heard it, a faint, almost human whisper, like someone sighing right outside the window. I paused, straining my ears. Nothing, just the crickets. I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks, or maybe a nocturnal animal. A few minutes later, though, a distinct, heavy thump echoed from the floorboards, directly above me. My heart gave a little jump. The cabin was old, settled. Old houses creak. I told myself that. The next night, the sounds intensified. As darkness fell and the oppressive summer humidity clung to everything, a series of light, rhythmic scratching noises began at my bedroom window. It was persistent, like fingernails dragging across the rough wood siding. I pulled back the curtain, peered into the blackness. Nothing. Just the dense wall of trees. A shiver, completely out of place in the humid air, traced its way down my spine. I moved to sleep on the pull-out couch downstairs, rationalizing it by telling myself the upstairs bedroom was too warm. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the heat. I woke before dawn on the fifth day, not to an alarm, but to the crushing weight of being watched. Every hair on my arms stood on end. My eyes snapped open, scanning the shadowy living room. The large, picture window that overlooked the woods was just a darker rectangle in the pre-dawn gloom. But I felt it, a presence just beyond the glass. A prickle of pure, unadulterated fear started in my gut. I lay there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity, until the first sliver of sunrise finally pierced the tree line, chasing away the shadows, and it seemed the feeling of dread. I spent the day hiking, distracting myself, trying to convince myself it was just cabin fever. That night was the worst. The air was still, heavy, like a shroud. I forced myself to go upstairs to the bedroom, determined not to let my imagination get the better of me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to focus on my breathing. Then the whispers started again. This time, they weren't outside. They were inside the cabin, faint, breathy, like dry leaves rustling, but with an undeniable human cadence. It sounded like an old woman's voice, frail and broken, murmuring something unintelligible. No, it wasn't unintelligible. It was just one word, repeated over and over, getting progressively clearer, closer. Alone, alone, alone. My blood ran cold, my entire body locked up. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the thin sheet up to my chin, as if it could somehow protect me. The scratching began again, this time at my bedroom door. Then a distinct rattle of the doorknob. Click. It was trying to turn it. I heard the faint groan of old hinges. The door slowly, agonizingly, opening. My eyes flew open. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness where light should have been. I could hear something moving on the other side. A slow, deliberate drag, like something heavy being pulled across the floorboards in the hallway. Then the distinct creak of the old wooden stairs. A downward progression, one step at a time. It was descending towards me. Panic seized me. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The air in the room grew colder, a chilling supernatural cold that defied the humid summer night. It felt like something was sucking the heat out of the very oxygen I was breathing. The whispers were louder now, closer, right outside my bedroom door. Alex, come alone, my name. It knew my name. Then a shadow fell over the window. Not the shadow of a tree or a cloud. This was a distinct, impossibly tall, skeletal figure, silhouetted against the faintest glow of the moon. It was too thin to be human, too elongated, with what looked like a distorted head tilting, as if peering in at me. Adrenaline surged through my veins, breaking the paralysis. I scrambled out of bed, grabbed my car keys from the nightstand, and stumbled down the stairs, not daring to look back at the open bedroom door. As I reached the living room, the cold was unbearable, the whispers now surrounding me, seemingly coming from all directions. The window onto the woods was entirely black. No moonlight penetration, just an inky void where I knew it was standing. My breath hitched. I could feel its gaze on me. I fumbled with the deadbolt on the front door, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the knob. The whispers hissed a final, guttural sound right in my ear, like a dry, ancient cough. I shoved the door open, practically falling onto the porch, gasping for breath, my lungs burning with the frigid air that seemed to have followed me from inside. I didn't bother with shoes. I sprinted barefoot across the rough-cut grass, gravel, digging into my soles towards my truck. I heard nothing behind me, no footsteps, no rustling in the woods, but I felt its eyes following me until I slammed the truck door shut, fumbling the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, a blessed sound. I threw it into reverse, spun around, and peeled down the long, unpaved driveway, showering gravel in my wake. I drove until the sun was fully up, until I hit the first gas station, until I was surrounded by other human beings. I called the rental agency from a payphone at that gas station, claiming a medical emergency and abandoning the cabin. I never went back for my belongings. I never even looked at photos of the cabin again, to this day. I don't know what was in that cabin. A spirit? A shadow entity? Something ancient and malevolent that resided in those quiet woods? All I know is that when the summer nights grow, warm and still, and the crickets begin their song, I still feel a distinct chill, a lingering sense of dread. And sometimes, in the deepest quiet hours, when I'm truly alone, I still hear that faint, dry whisper just at the edge of my hearing, calling my name. And I wonder, was it ever truly confined to that cabin? Or did it somehow follow me home?